Today we're using this $60,000 laser scanner to create the perfect CPU cooler Coldplate with microscopic accuracy and precision. We had these CPU cooler cold plates custom manufactured to match the curvature of the heat spreader when under clamping pressure from the Intel ILM and AMDs. Next, we used this chemically reactive pressure paper to create some scans of how the IHS contacts the cold plate, and then we gave it to Mike to make pseudo-color images. And all of that brings us to thermal testing, where we finally get to evaluate a long-running weak point in cooler reviews, which is the IHS style. Now, the reason to test on a single style of IHS is because to get a proper, in-depth, and accurate cooler review, just for one CPU, it can take 40 hours. So we have to pick and choose carefully, but we want to evaluate this because in theory, if you choose any one of these four coolers that we have on the table, it's possible that they perform drastically different depending on which CPU you put it on top of. And that's because despite all being FUMA 3s, we've had them heavily modified. So that's what we're looking at today with science. We brought you this video with our brand new Cyberskeleton V2 limited foil shirt on store.gamersnexus.net, but you can also grab one of our PC building mod mats or highly heat resistant silicone soldering and project mats or other items on the store. These videos are part of our ongoing in-depth lab testing efforts that we've been working on for well over 10 years now. But thanks to you all supporting us directly, we've been able to really ramp that testing quality lately. All the new 3D animations you saw in our cross-flow fan video and this one, and our ultra-precision 3D laser scanner alongside our hemi-anechoic chamber are our way of reinvesting into the channel and into publicly available engineering education for computer hardware. If you'd like to support our efforts to inform and report, head over to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our items. The skeleton foil shirts will only be available for a limited time and were introduced as a way to support our EK investigation. We also just recently introduced our copper-plated mule mugs with a fitting thermal conductivity formula laser etched into the hammered surface. Thanks for your support of our vision for more scientific content, and let's get back to it. We added Intel testing to our CPU cooler reviews a couple months ago. You'll see it in some of the more recent testing. It's because we've been working on this. It's a lot more time, but we think it's worth it, and enough of you watch these. By the way, thank you. We're able to support that effort now. So here's some interesting data, and we'll get to this more throughout this video. So these are 4 cooler cold plates that we used our 3D laser scanner to scan and take a look at how the cold plates are shaped. And the way this came about is we were talking with Scythe's founder and one of its engineers, Kitagawa-san, at Computex last year, and the concept came up where I asked him, is it possible for you to make a golden sample cooler? Can you make the perfect cooler and fine-tune it specifically to one platform or IHS? And he said, let us try it out. So we asked them to make a few different coolers. They did not sponsor this. This is purely a scientific curiosity from us, from a methodological standpoint, and from them because they were trying to basically determine if it makes sense to productize anything. This is actually what we'll call the golden sample. These are magnified 100 times, so it's really sort of distorted to show the differences. This is one of the other ones. This is a retail sample we bought from Amazon. Much less of that gradient. It's a lot flatter, but it is nowhere near as flat as these two. These we had them custom make because we use an AM4 bench for our sort of primary data set, and we've just added Intel back in to try and accommodate these other IHS shapes. So by having a custom flat cold plate made, in theory, they'd be able to game the system on an AM4 platform, but it's also a valid way to try and cool it better. So this is a concept that's come up before where the cold plate, or actually the cooler manufacturers, they have to choose, do they want to fine tune for basically one IHS, or do they want to make something that works pretty well on everything? Where you get most of the deformation between the cold plate and the CPUs is actually going to be the CPUs. Here's a modern Intel CPU with the ILM clamped down and at a 100x magnification. You can see that at the points where the clamp applies the force, the middle edges on the long side, the CPU is clearly pushed downwards and deformed centrally. You can see that in our animation we made back when we reviewed the contact frames, which are known to flatten the CPU. We've already proven that point, and it's a known quantity, but what we didn't have was these cool 3D scans to understand exactly how it's deforming. Now that indent will absolutely manifest itself in the form of contact with a cold plate. We'd ideally want a cold plate to mate with it perfectly and sort of socket in. Now what's interesting is that an unsocketed Intel CPU just sitting on a flat surface in the scanner is almost completely flat, even if it's been mounted before. This is magnified at 100x also, and even still, we're really only seeing the usual microscopic imperfections, but very little curvature. This CPU has been used a lot, so if it were to be permanently bent, we would see it by now. That clamp is definitely deforming it in ways for which the cold plate can be tuned by Scythe in their manufacturing of the custom test samples today. Here's a look at an AM4 CPU. Even at 100x and clamped, the CPU is almost perfectly flat. The old PGA socket doesn't change anything from flat, so we're just showing this, and there's a slight ripple in the surface, but that's a mix of the magnification and the imperfect process of leveling the device being scanned. You can consider this as functionally flat. That means Intel and AMD AM4 would have different cold plate curvature optimizations that a cooler manufacturer could do if they wanted to fine tune it. AM5 has an ILM though, and that's where this gets really interesting. AM5's pattern is woefully opposite of what we just saw with Intel's. You can see that it bows upward in the center at the points perpendicular to the clamping direction. This is going to be problematic. Now, in terms of maximum cooler compatibility, this is actually the worst possible outcome, because what happens, just to help people understand and map those 3D images to something in real life, basically on the AMD one, along this strip centrally and sort of pointing towards the camera on these narrower points where there's no clamp, what we have is technically a bowing up. This is coming outward centrally. And on Intel, if we come over here, it's basically the opposite. They're almost counter to each other perfectly, where this one is dipping inward and following that arcing path towards these clamp points. Now, most coolers don't actually fine-tune the cold plate to this level. There are some. Noctua has talked about it in years past, but the fact that the CPU indentations effectively intersect means the ideal setup would be very CPU specific. In an ideal world, you'd have one for AM5 CPUs, one for Intel current, and then one for AM4. And you would need to maintain all of those as a manufacturer. And for many boring reasons, such as economies of scale, supply and demand, and customers getting confused, that's not really feasible. But it's still fun to explore. Now, for the coolers that we have today, we have a review sort of golden sample. This is the one where we asked Scythe, hey, pull the best possible one you can find and try to tune it for that cold plate curvature. And basically we're asking for, what if you tuned it for Intel, effectively? And then the next we were looking at were flat samples. So we're calling these B and E, golden samples. So these are flatter. Those are up on the screen behind me. It's those two on the left. And then the final one is a retail sample we just bought off Amazon, blind purchase, and that's just sort of to see, okay, but what do you get if you just buy one off the shelf? Now, cooler variance overall is extremely low if you have good test processes, which we do, and because of the changes made to the cold plate in each of these, any change outside of a 1 degree difference would be considered as outside of error. And of course, all of this content and in-depth testing is only possible because you all have supported us enough over the years with Patreon and with store purchases so we could buy that laser scanner, which allowed us to map the IHS to the cold plates. Here's a scan of a normal Scythe FUMA 3 without modifications. When unmagnified just from off of Amazon, it just looks kind of flat. You can see some coloring indicating depth changes at the micron level, but to really see the curvature, we need to magnify this. And this scan is boosted at 100x magnification, which reveals details invisible to the human eye. You can see that the cold plate is curving towards the laser. If you imagine that the laser is actually the CPU, it's convex and curving centrally towards the CPU IHS. However, as this is magnified at 100x, it's so slight that it might not have a real impact on the contact. Pressure distribution and flexing of the plate occur during install, so it's further possible that this flattens out once we actually secure it to the IHS. Either way, the retail FUMA 3 is heavily curved as compared to our custom-made AM4 samples where we requested a flat surface. This is golden sample E, which you can see is incredibly flat by contrast. It's actually impressive how flat they got this plate. It should work well for AM4. This is sample B, which likewise is overall very flat. They basically made 2 because they weren't sure how good they could get it. And finally, here's the actual golden sample unit, where this one should be amazing for Intel because the indentation lines up with the concavity in the IHS when the ILM pressure is applied. This will be the one to pay attention to in the Intel testing. The scientific process involves disclosing limitations, so we have a few for this testing. First of all, we can't control things like the heat pipes or the fin stack. The fin stack density, the actual design, it's all the same from unit to unit, it's the same product. But technically speaking, heat pipes can have sort of a yield where they can be better or worse, but Scythe has a controlled process for selecting its heat pipes. Actually, Noctua is another company that has told us in the past. It does a lot of selection and sampling for heat pipes, so we should be about as controlled as we can get there. The fans are another variable, but we chose to eliminate them. The way we did that, we used the same set of 2 fans. We put them in the same order, so the front fan's always the front, middle fan's always the middle, same RPM, and all that's validated. So that's controlled, it's taken care of pretty well. All right, now we need a hypothesis. First, the laser scans. Here's how everything should work. This golden sample cooler should work best on both AMD AM4 and Intel LGA1700. The reason is because it's a clever combination of engineering from Scythe and the process of tweaking this cold plate. When we asked them to curve the cold plate in a convex way to mate with the Intel CPU, both of us realized that this curve could be slightly offset to bias it towards the hottest part of the Intel CPU and still land right between most of the silicon on the AMD CPU, like the I/O die. That means that while it mates perfectly with LGA1700, even though it's not flat, we can apply the most pressure to the chiplet area of the flat AM4 CPU. In theory, this makes it the best possible for each, but it would be suboptimal for AM5 due to the perpendicularly intersecting curve. Sample E and Sample B coolers are flatter, so those should theoretically work better on AM4 than on Intel. Sample E is the best of these two. The flatness means that Intel, if we exaggerate its curvature, will end up with reduced pressure centrally where the die is, while AMD will end up with evenly distributed pressure across the IHS, but less than the golden sample on the chiplet location. Here are the Intel thermal results. We theorized that the golden sample would do best on Intel, and it does, by a lot. This is actually really exciting data because everything about the way the cold plate's shaped for this one says that it should mate nearly perfectly with that indent on Intel. The end result is almost 3 degrees improved over one of the flattest plates, so it's no wonder that Scythe asked us last year if we thought they should sell separate AMD and Intel coolers, and no wonder why Noctua has done that sparingly in the past. An extra 2 degrees in the world of air coolers is the difference between the top and the middle of the chart. That's huge. The core-to-core delta remains similar, so we're still limited there by the IHS design, the silicone adhesive, and the solder. Sample B has a very slight curvature to it, and it outperforms Sample E here as a result on Intel. So this is super exciting. Let's look at the flattest CPU we have, AMD AM4. The top to bottom range is 1.8 degrees. That's relatively tight together, but definitely outside of our typical 1 degree target for review. In this instance, with 3 specially tuned samples, our retail unit ends up the warmest. The golden sample we requested at Computex ran at 58.2 degrees, so that's about a 1 degree difference from our typical acceptable margin of error when measured against the retail unit, and some of that is run-to-run variance. But there is a real difference here. This shows that the golden sample we had made still works optimally on AM4 as a result of the highest point of pressure being the chiplet area, while in Intel it's the mating that benefits the design. Sample E is functionally the same. Because of how flat it is, its performance is tied for the best performer on AM4 out of these samples. That's a big change from the Intel result, where E was actually the worst performer by 3 degrees. So the theory is proving itself to be real. That's super cool. Sample B wasn't quite as flat, so it didn't do as well here. Despite being mostly flat, it had an unbiased, slight curvature that wasn't focused on the chiplets. That worked against it on AM4, but slightly helped it on Intel earlier. We also ran some quick AM5 tests using a 7950X set to a clock and V-core that had it pulling 185 watts. We found Sample E to be the best performer by a lot, actually, against retail. Going flatter was better than a curve intersecting in the wrong direction. Sample B was also up there, followed by the golden sample. As expected, the golden sample unit lost rank with AM5, otherwise they just make it for all platforms. Retail is unfortunately low for all of these. It does okay, as realistically we're talking a couple degrees, but it appears that there might be a better way to make this. Maybe this is an indication that Scythe should consider adopting one of these experimental designs. In fact, here's a quick table to rank them in each test. You can see that the retail unit was the worst in 2 tests and basically tied for that rank on LGA1700. Now there's one downside to the way we did this testing. Since we did ask for finely tuned coolers, it's possible that we also intersected an area of sampling bias otherwise. For instance, maybe because we bought the retail unit 6 months after the custom ones were made, something changed. Either way, generally speaking, the golden sample did best in 2 places and was only slightly disadvantaged on AM5. This seems to be the best one for the future overall. We'll regroup with Scythe later this month at Computex to talk about the findings and see if they can apply them to their manufacturing, so check back for that in about 3 to 4 weeks. This next section is super cool. Here's a pressure scan of an AM4 CPU. The far left scan of the golden sample shows extremely high pressure centrally, right down across the middle of the CPU. If you look at the flatter samples B and E, you can see that we have a wider area of coverage across the entire CPU surface, but reduced pressure centrally. That higher pressure mattered more in our thermal testing for this one. The retail sample has a mixture of higher spread across the IHS and higher pressure centrally, but it has some spotty weak points. And here's the LGA1700 Intel CPU. In this one, you can see the golden sample unit has extremely high pressure centrally, and the 2 flat samples do exactly what we expected. They lose contact along the critical edges of the central channel, and they have reduced pressure centrally, with only spotty areas of high pressure. For us, this is actually the most exciting part of the job, because we get to test a concept and then see how it works, and not every aspect worked as we expected it to, but in this particular aspect, it's exactly what you'd predict from a flat plate on a CPU that gets curved inwards by the ILM. Super cool. The retail unit is more similar to the golden sample, just with its less pronounced curve, resulting in a slightly reduced contact along the top edge. Finally, just for some physical visuals of the real product, we took a bunch of footage of the coolers with a high precision engineered square and a flashlight. We'll just show some of that now. You can see in some situations where the light really cuts under the square, illustrating the amount of curvature in the plate. But as we've learned now, that curvature can be a powerful tool in improving performance in some CPUs by focusing pressure in key areas or by matching the IHS. There were others we tested with the engineered square that blocked most of the light from shining through, and those were generally the custom flat ones that we had made. So as an example, that golden unit that we had made, the perfect one, it ended up being the best performer. That was as expected. What we didn't fully expect was that the flat units, despite actually having the most even distribution of pressure, at least in one instance, didn't end up being the best performer for AM4. Now, another thing that did work out was we expected they would be worse for Intel, for LGA1700, because of that curvature down in the center. And the pressure scans, we saw exactly that, which is super cool and exciting. But then, likewise, the discovery, or kind of the maybe emphasis on something that was already maybe assumed but not proven in our instance, of the fact that the higher pressure contact right across the chiplets served as a more valuable approach to the Coldplate design than having that even distribution across the whole IHS. Because without testing it, either one seems like it could be a better approach to making a Coldplate. And you need that data to really understand how it works out in reality, and we have that now. So super cool stuff. From a product perspective, basically the way this pans out is it looks like if you wanted to tune the Coldplate for LGA1700 and AM4, you kind of could, as long as you bias that curvature as a manufacturer, designer, towards where the chiplets are located on AM4, and then otherwise it'll just mostly nest within the Intel indent, assuming an ILM is being used, whereas another productized way of doing this would be sort of the Arctic approach of them saying, no, there's only one way to install this cooler, it's with a contact frame, period, that's the only way, no ILMs available. So that would be another way to sort of force a known contact patch on the CPU across multiple variations. To really maximize this with AM5 also, you'd basically get into an area where in order to have the perfect, absolute best contact patch without any compromise whatsoever, you're going to run at least a couple different SKUs. And that's a problem because it becomes more difficult to scale, it's more validation to do, it's more customer confusion, and it could affect economies of scale in terms of pricing because now there's different cold plates that are being made. So if the company doesn't own its own factories, then that can start to become a problem too in terms of production and batch size. Now for us, we originally ran all of our tests for coolers on AM4. We had to pick one platform. When we picked it, it was the most popular, at least for our audience at the time. And each cooler takes about 40 hours just to test on one platform alone across 2 to 3 CPUs to get numbers that anyone can even begin to trust in our opinions. Now we've detailed that process before, but it requires multiple mounts and passes per mount, and each cooler is about a week of testing work for Mike. And even in spite of all of that, because of some optimizations we've made internally, that's why we added Intel testing a couple months back. So you've seen that in the Freezer 36 review, the Liquid Freezer 3, the Deep Cool Mystique had that testing as well, and a couple others we haven't posted yet. That's why we added it. And we liked doing these in the past because it's a public, transparent way of saying, hey, here's a bunch of research for how we should test things, and we use that to drive our decisions, which obviously are all governed ultimately by time and cost and things like that. So we're trying to fine tune for the best possible reviews. Even though these findings show that there can be a difference from cold plate design, ultimately what we see is that there's just a lot of nuance there. And to truly know, you'd have to test on each platform that's relevant. And so, of course, there's sort of a realistic limitation to anyone's testing, not just ours. We go a bit overboard already, but anyone else's too, where you have to settle on something, define it, and configure it in a way that is trustworthy. That's the number one important thing. Adding extras after that to try and account for different types of CPUs, that's kind of extra if there's additional time to spare in the process and additional validation that can be spent on it. But we're trying to do our best to cover all of it, and this is part of why. So really exciting and interesting stuff. Definitely shows why if time permits, it makes sense to try and test both platforms, but there's going to be a sacrifice somewhere. So one example would be you might end up with only high power testing or only medium power testing, but covering 2 IHSs. So there's that test matrix, and you got to thin it out at some point, otherwise it ends up being easily 80 plus hours to test one cooler. But I think we found a pretty good balance here, and we're excited to keep rolling out more stuff with these findings. Thanks for watching. As always, fun to do this stuff. Subscribe for more. You can support us directly on store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.